The rain drummed against the 12th floor windows of the Morrison building like impatient fingers tapping on glass. I sat in the farthest chair from the mahogany conference table, close enough to hear every word but far enough away that my presence felt optional. The leather chair was too big for me, making me feel like a child playing dress-up in grown-up furniture. Across the polished wood surface, my cousin Michael adjusted his silver cufflinks and checked his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He looked like he belonged here, in this room that smelled of expensive coffee and legal documents. His charcoal suit fit him perfectly, tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders and confident posture. Everything about him screamed success, from his perfectly styled dark hair to his Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. When he caught his reflection in the turned-off television mounted on the wall, he smiled at what he saw. Uncle Robert sat beside Michael, scrolling through emails on his phone with the practiced indifference of someone who conducted million-dollar deals over lunch. His gray suit was conservative but expensive, and his silver hair was combed back in that way that suggested regular visits to high-end salons. Aunt Linda perched next to him, her pearls catching the dim afternoon light filtering through the rain-soaked windows. She kept patting Michael's arm and whispering reassurances, as if he needed any. My own father, Uncle David, sat quietly near the middle of the table, his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for permission to exist. He wore the same navy suit he'd worn to every important family event for the past decade, the one with the slight fray at the left cuff that he thought nobody noticed. Every few minutes he'd glance at me with that apologetic look I'd grown accustomed to, the one that seemed to say sorry for existing, sorry for taking up space, sorry for having a daughter who didn't fit the family mold. Attorney Patricia Valdez stood at the head of the table, organizing documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this countless times before. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with silver threading through her black hair that she wore pulled back in a neat bun. Her burgundy blazer was professional but warm, and when she looked at each of us, her dark eyes held a kindness that felt genuine. She'd represented Grandma Rose for 15 years, she'd told us earlier, handling everything from property purchases to charitable donations. The Willamette River stretched out below us, gray and churning under the October storm. Portland's skyline looked muted through the rain, all soft edges and blurred lights. I found myself staring at a tugboat making its way downstream, wishing I could be anywhere but in this room, where I felt like an intruder at my own grandmother's final gathering. Grandma Rose had been gone for 3 weeks now, 3 weeks since I'd found her in her garden, kneeling beside her tomato plants with her gardening gloves still on her hands, and a peaceful expression on her weathered face. She'd died the way she'd lived, quietly and without fuss, surrounded by the things she'd nurtured with her own hands. The doctors said her heart simply stopped, that at 82, after a life of hard work and simple pleasures, she'd simply decided it was time to rest. She'd come to America from Taiwan in 1965, with nothing but a sewing machine, and a fierce determination to build something better for her family. For 40 years she'd worked as a seamstress, first in a factory downtown, then from her living room, taking in alterations and custom work for neighbors who couldn't afford department store prices. Her English had never been perfect, peppered with Mandarin phrases when she got excited or frustrated, but her hands could work magic with fabric and thread. Everyone in the family had expected this day to be straightforward. Grandma Rose had lived modestly her entire life, clipping coupons, shopping at thrift stores, growing her own vegetables in the small backyard of her Selwood home. She drove the same Honda Civic for 20 years, mended clothes instead of replacing them, and never took a vacation that cost more than a tank of gas to the Oregon coast. The family narrative had always been simple. Rose was practical, frugal, and would leave whatever she had to Michael, because he was the one who'd made something of himself. Michael had the MBA from Portland State, the successful real estate development company, the house in the West Hills with the heated pool and three-car garage. He was married to Jennifer, a dental hygienist, who looked like she stepped out of a catalog, and they had two perfectly behaved children who played piano and spoke Mandarin on weekends. He was everything the family wanted him to be: successful, stable, and proudly carrying on the Chen name in the business world. I, on the other hand, was the family's polite disappointment. At 27, I was still single, still renting a studio apartment in Southeast Portland, still teaching art to elementary school kids for a salary that barely covered my student loans. My degree in fine arts had been met with the kind of strained smiles usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. "Sarah's always been the artistic type," they'd say, the same way you might say someone was prone to catching colds. While Michael bought investment properties and expanded his business, I spent my evenings volunteering at the community center, teaching painting classes to kids whose parents worked 2 jobs and couldn't afford art supplies. While he networked at Chamber of Commerce mixers, I organized supply drives and helped families fill out paperwork for free lunch programs. The family saw Michael's accomplishments in his bank statements and property holdings. My accomplishments were harder to quantify: the shy kid who learned to express herself through watercolors, the teenager who found confidence in sculpture, the single mother who discovered she had talent with a paintbrush. Grandma Rose had always seemed to understand this difference between Michael and me, though she'd never said so directly. When the family gathered for holidays, she'd ask Michael about his latest projects and nod approvingly at his success stories. But she'd also slip me extra dumplings when no one was looking, and ask quiet questions about my students, my classes, the small ways I was trying to make the world a little brighter for kids who needed it most. She'd lived her entire adult life in the same 2-story house on 13th Avenue, a modest place with a front porch that sagged slightly and a backyard that bloomed with vegetables and flowers she'd coaxed from the Pacific Northwest soil. The house had always felt like a sanctuary to me, filled with the smells of ginger and star anise, the sound of her ancient sewing machine humming late into the night, and the gentle presence of a woman who'd learned to find joy in small, steady things. Attorney Valdez cleared her throat, and the quiet
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
conversations around the table faded into silence. She opened the leather portfolio in front of her and adjusted her reading glasses. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed through the city streets. "Before we begin," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing family emotions in difficult times, "I want to express my condolences to all of you. Rose Chen was an extraordinary woman, and I feel privileged to have known her. She was meticulous in her planning, and very specific about her wishes." Uncle Robert nodded curtly, already mentally calculating numbers. Aunt Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I hadn't seen any actual tears. Michael sat forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him like a student waiting for test results he was confident he'd aced. My father continued his impression of furniture, trying to take up as little space as possible. I found myself studying the grain of the wooden table, following the dark lines that swirled and curved like abstract art. My hands were folded in my lap, and I could feel the calluses on my fingertips from years of handling paintbrushes and clay. My dress was navy blue, borrowed from my college roommate because I didn't own anything appropriate for occasions like this. The shoes were mine, black flats I'd bought for job interviews, and they were already pinching my feet. "Rose's will is quite straightforward," Attorney Valdez continued, "though there are some specific instructions she wanted me to follow precisely. She spent considerable time revising these documents over the past several years, and every clause reflects her careful consideration. She lifted the first document, and I noticed her hands were steady, professional. This was routine for her, parsing out the remnants of lives lived and deciding who gets what pieces of someone's existence. But for us, sitting in this rain-soaked conference room, it was the final word from someone who'd shaped our family's understanding of work, sacrifice, and love. The house on 13th Avenue, she read in a clear, measured voice, including all furnishings, personal effects, and the garden, I leave to my grandson Michael Chen, along with my 2004 Honda Civic, and the funds in my personal checking account at Umpqua Bank, account ending in 7,429. The relief in the room was palpable. Aunt Linda let out a soft sigh, and Uncle Robert nodded approvingly. Michael's smile was genuine but controlled, the expression of someone who'd received exactly what he'd expected. He reached over and squeezed his mother's hand, and she beamed at him like he'd just graduated summa cum laude all over again. The checking account currently holds approximately $18,000, Attorney Valdez added, and there are no outstanding debts against the property. My father shifted in his chair, and I caught him glancing at me with that familiar mixture of pride and concern. He was happy for Michael, genuinely so, but I could see him calculating whether this outcome would hurt me, whether I'd been expecting something different. The truth was, I hadn't expected anything at all. Grandma Rose had already given me more than the family knew about: the art supplies she'd bought for my classroom, the quiet checks she'd written when my car needed repairs, the grocery bags she'd press into my hands when I visited, claiming she'd accidentally bought too much food for one person. Attorney Valdez turned to a second document, and the room's attention sharpened again. This was likely the distribution of smaller items, jewelry perhaps, or specific sentimental pieces. Families always got complicated over the personal effects, the things that carried memories more than monetary value. To my granddaughter Sarah Chen, she read, and something in the tone made everyone look up, I leave my sewing machine, my recipe box, and my jewelry box with the blue velvet lining. I felt a warmth spread through my chest. The sewing machine was a 1960s Singer, heavy as a small car and built to last forever. Grandma Rose had taught me to use it when I was 12, guiding my hands as I hemmed my first dress. The recipe box held decades of carefully written cards, some in English, some in Mandarin characters I couldn't read but had always admired for their elegant strokes. The jewelry box was nothing expensive, just costume pieces and a few gold earrings, but it played a tiny music box tune when you opened it, and as a child, I'd spent hours listening to it while Grandma told stories about her life in Taiwan. Additionally, Attorney Valdez continued, and her voice took on a different quality, more formal but somehow warmer, Sarah will receive a sealed letter that Rose specifically requested be given to her privately, along with the key to safety deposit box 247 at Wells Fargo downtown. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before. This wasn't the comfortable silence of expected outcomes. This was the silence of confusion, of pieces that didn't fit the established pattern. Uncle Robert frowned slightly, and Aunt Linda's eyebrows drew together in a way that suggested she was recalculating something. Michael's expression shifted from satisfaction to puzzlement. He'd gotten the house, the car, the checking account, everything valuable and practical that Grandma Rose had accumulated over her lifetime, but a safety deposit box suggested there were assets nobody knew about, secrets that had been kept even from the family's golden child. My father looked as confused as everyone else, but there was something different in his expression, a flicker of curiosity mixed with what might have been hope. He'd always been the quiet one in a family of loud personalities. realities. The middle child who'd chosen stability over ambition, who'd raised his daughter to be kind rather than successful. Maybe he was wondering if his mother had seen something in me that the rest of the family had missed. "I don't understand," Aunt Linda said, her voice carrying that edge it got when things didn't go according to her expectations. "What kind of safety deposit box?" Rose never mentioned any safety deposit box to us. Attorney Valdez's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught something in her eyes that might have been amusement. Rose was very private about certain aspects of her financial affairs. The contents of the safety deposit box were not disclosed to me, only that Sarah should receive access to it upon Rose's death. "But surely there must be some indication of what's in it," Uncle Robert pressed, his businessman's instincts kicking in. "Some inventory or valuation for estate tax purposes." The box was opened and inventoried for tax purposes, Attorney Valdez replied carefully, but Rose specifically instructed that the contents be revealed only to Sarah, and only when she chooses to open it herself. I felt all eyes in the room turn to me, and suddenly the borrowed dress felt too tight, the air too thin. I wasn't used to being the center of attention in family gatherings, and I definitely wasn't used to being the person with secrets. My role had always been to sit quietly, to listen to others' stories, to clean up after family dinners and help with the dishes while the adults discussed important things. "Well," Michael said, his voice still friendly but with an undertone I couldn't quite identify, "I'm sure it's just some old photos or maybe some jewelry she wanted to make sure Sarah got. You know how sentimental Grandma could be about keeping family history." He was trying to minimize it, to return the moment to familiar territory where he was the important one, and I was the afterthought who got the sentimental leftovers. But something in Attorney Valdez's expression suggested it wasn't that simple. She was looking at me with a kind of knowing attention that made me feel like there was a conversation happening that I wasn't yet part of. "Is there anything else?" Uncle Robert asked, already beginning to gather his things. In his mind the important business was concluded. Michael had inherited the house and the money, the tangible assets that mattered in a world measured by bank statements and property values. Whatever was in the safety deposit box was probably just an old woman's way of making sure her granddaughter got some keepsake. "That concludes the formal reading," Attorney Valdez said, closing the portfolio. "Michael, I'll have the property deed transferred within the week, and the bank will contact you about accessing the checking account. Sarah, I'll need to schedule a separate appointment with you to handle the safety deposit box access." The room began to stir with the restless energy of people ready to move on to the next thing. Aunt Linda was already planning out loud how they'd help Michael transition into the house, what repairs might be needed, whether they should keep or sell some of the furniture. Uncle Robert was asking practical questions about property taxes and utility transfers. My father sat quietly, occasionally nodding at appropriate moments but mostly just waiting for permission to leave. I remained in my chair, holding the small brass key that Attorney Valdez had placed in front of me. It was warm from being in her hand, heavier than I'd expected, and engraved with numbers I couldn't quite make out in the dim conference room lighting. The sealed envelope lay beside it, my name written across the front in Grandma Rose's careful handwriting, the letters formed with the precision of someone who'd learned English as a second language and never took the ability to write it for granted. Michael stood up, straightening his jacket and extending his hand to Attorney Valdez. "Thank you for handling everything so professionally," he said, his smile confident and grateful. "I know Grandma Rose appreciated your help over the years. She spoke of you often," Attorney Valdez replied, shaking his hand. "She was very proud of your success." Then she turned to me, and her expression shifted slightly, became more personal somehow. "Sarah, Why don't you call my office tomorrow? We can arrange a time that's convenient for you to visit the bank. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The weight of everyone's attention felt overwhelming, and I had the distinct sensation that I was standing at the edge of something I didn't understand. The key sat in my palm like a small metal secret, and the envelope seemed to pulse with unspoken words from someone who'd spent her life communicating more through actions than speeches. As the family began to file out of the conference room, making plans for dinner, and discussing the logistics of dealing with Grandma Rose's house, I found myself moving more slowly. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the windows, and the Portland skyline was beginning to emerge from the gray afternoon fog. Down on the river, that same tugboat was still making its steady way downstream, and I wondered where it was going, what cargo it carried, whether the person steering it felt as uncertain about their destination as I suddenly did about mine. Aunt Linda paused beside my chair, her expression a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed irritation. "I'm sure whatever's in that box will be lovely, dear," she said, her tone carrying the kind of false sweetness that suggested she thought the opposite. Rose always did have a soft spot for keeping old things. She said it like keeping old things was a character flaw, a sign of someone who couldn't tell the difference between valuable and worthless. But as I watched her gather her designer purse and check her appearance in the darkened television screen, I realized that maybe Grandma Rose had understood something about value that the rest of the family had never quite grasped. Michael appeared at my other shoulder, his hand briefly touching my arm, in what might have been meant as a comforting gesture. "Hey Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that older cousin tone he'd used when we were kids, and he was explaining why he got the bigger bedroom. "I just want you to know, whatever's in there, I'm happy for you. Grandma Rose obviously wanted you to have something special," but there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested he was wondering the same thing everyone else was wondering. What could an old seamstress who lived on Social Security and coupons possibly have hidden away in a bank vault? My father was the last to approach, and his expression held none of the confusion or irritation of the others. Instead, he looked at me with the same quiet pride I'd seen when I'd graduated college, when I'd gotten my first teaching job, when I'd shown him the thank you cards my students had made for me. He understood what it was like to be overlooked in a family of big personalities, and maybe he was hoping that his mother had found a way to acknowledge what he'd never been able to say out loud, that sometimes the quiet ones see the most, do the most, and deserve the most recognition. "Mom always paid attention to things the rest of us missed," he said quietly, so only I could hear. "Whatever she left you, she had her reasons." Then they were gone, their voices echoing down the hallway as they discussed dinner plans and weekend schedules, leaving me alone in the conference room with Attorney Valdez, who was gathering her papers with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd learned that the most important conversations often happened after everyone else had left the room. The key sat in my palm, still warm, still heavy with possibility. The envelope waited beside it, and I could feel the weight of words that had been chosen carefully, written in the careful script of someone who'd spent her life measuring twice and cutting once, who'd learned that the most important things were often said quietly, when no one else was listening. Outside, Portland continued its October afternoon routine, rain and river, and the steady movement of a city that never quite stopped growing, never quite stopped changing. But in that conference room, 12 floors above the Willamette, time felt suspended, as if I was standing at the threshold between who I'd always been and who I might become, holding a small brass key that promised to unlock more than just a safety deposit box. Part 2. The silence that followed felt different from the polite quiet of a concluded meeting. Attorney Valdez remained standing at the head of the table, her hands resting on the closed portfolio, but something in her posture suggested the business wasn't entirely finished. The rain had intensified again, creating a steady rhythm against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gray expanse of downtown Portland. I sat motionless in the oversized leather chair, the brass key growing slick in my sweaty palm, the sealed envelope seeming to pulse with unread words. The weight of my family's expectations, their barely concealed confusion about the safety deposit box, pressed down on me like the low October clouds hanging over the city. Michael had gotten everything that mattered in their world: the house, the car, the bank account with its respectable but modest balance. I had received what appeared to be sentimental afterthoughts, and a mystery that nobody understood. "Sarah," Attorney Valdez said, her voice cutting through my spiraling thoughts, "would you mind staying for a few more minutes? There are some additional details about your grandmother's wishes that I need to discuss with you privately." The request sent a ripple of unease through the room. Uncle Robert paused in his gathering of papers, and Aunt Linda's perfectly penciled eyebrows drew together in a frown that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being excluded from family business. Michael's confident smile faltered slightly, replaced by the expression of someone who just realized the game might have rules he didn't know about. Additional details. Aunt Linda's voice carried that sharp edge it acquired whenever she sensed information being withheld from her. "I don't understand why there would be anything that couldn't be discussed with the entire family present." Attorney Valdez's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught a flicker of something that might have been steel beneath her diplomatic exterior. Rose was very specific about her instructions regarding certain aspects of the estate. Some matters were to be handled privately, with individual beneficiaries. Uncle Robert shifted his weight, his businessman's instincts clearly agitated by the suggestion of undisclosed assets or arrangements. "With all due respect, Patricia, if there are additional components to my mother's estate, don't we have a right to know about them? For tax purposes, if nothing else, all tax obligations have been properly addressed," she replied smoothly. "This is simply a matter of following Rose's explicit wishes regarding the distribution of certain personal items and information." The tension in the room was palpable now, crackling beneath the surface of polite family interactions like electricity before a storm. Michael cleared his throat, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when he was trying to manage a situation that wasn't going according to his expectations. "Look, I'm sure whatever Grandma Rose wanted to tell Sarah is perfectly fine with all of us," he said, gesturing broadly as if to encompass the entire family's agreement. "We don't have any secrets from each other, right, Sarah? Maybe it would be easier if we all heard whatever it is together." There was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten, a subtle pressure that felt familiar from decades of family gatherings where my opinions were solicited as a formality, before being gently overruled by louder, more confident voices. He was trying to fold me back into the comfortable pattern where he made the decisions and I went along with them, where his judgment about what was best carried more weight than my actual preferences. But something about holding that brass key, about having my name written in Grandma Rose's careful handwriting on that sealed envelope, made me feel different. Not stronger exactly, but more solid somehow, like I was finally standing on ground that belonged to me. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice, "I'd prefer to hear whatever Grandma Rose wanted to tell me privately. If that's what she wanted, then that's what we should do." The words hung in the air like a small declaration of independence, and I could see the shift in everyone's expressions as they processed the fact that I had just politely but firmly declined to be managed. My father's eyebrows rose slightly, but there was something that looked like pride in his expression. Uncle Robert's frown deepened, and Aunt Linda's lips pressed into a thin line that suggested she was reassessing her understanding of the family dynamics. Michael's smile became more forced, the expression of someone who was used to getting his way through charm, and was discovering that his usual tools weren't working. "Of course, Sarah, I didn't mean to pressure you, I just thought, family transparency and all that."
but his eyes held a flicker of something that might have been worry, as if he was beginning to wonder whether the safety deposit box contained something more significant than old photographs and sentimental jewelry. The shift from confident assumption to uncertain calculation was subtle but unmistakable, and I realized that for the first time in our lives, I was the one holding information that he wanted. "We'll call you later, sweetheart," Aunt Linda said, her voice bright with false warmth, as she gathered her designer purse and checked her reflection in the dark television screen. "Maybe we can all have dinner this weekend, and you can tell us about whatever treasures Rose left for you." The word treasures was delivered with just enough emphasis to make it clear she considered the likelihood of actual treasures to be minimal. In her worldview, treasures came in the form of real estate investments and stock portfolios, not in safety deposit boxes maintained by elderly seamstresses who clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores. My father approached my chair, his movements careful and deliberate as if he was navigating around something fragile. "Take your time, honey," he said quietly, his hand briefly touching my shoulder. "Your grandmother was a thoughtful woman. Whatever she wanted you to know, she had good reasons for keeping it private." There was something in his voice that suggested he understood secrets, that maybe he'd learned over the years that the quietest people in the family sometimes saw the most, kept the most important things to themselves, until the right moment to share them. He kissed the top of my head, a gesture so gentle and unexpected that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Then they were gone, their voices fading down the hallway as they made plans for lunch and discussed the logistics of helping Michael move into Grandma Rose's house. The conference room felt larger without them, the mahogany table stretching out like a polished lake, the rain-washed windows offering a view of a city that suddenly seemed full of possibilities I'd never noticed before. Attorney Valdez waited until the sound of their footsteps disappeared entirely before moving around the table to take the chair beside me. Up close, I could see the laugh lines around her eyes, the silver threading through
her dark hair, the small scar on her chin that spoke of a life lived fully rather than carefully. She set a second, thicker envelope on the table between us, this one sealed with red wax that bore the impression of what looked like a rose. "Your grandmother was one of the most remarkable people I've ever had the privilege to represent," she said, her professional demeanor softening into something more personal. "She came to see me about 5 years ago, not long after you started teaching at Roosevelt Elementary. She'd been thinking about her legacy, about what she wanted to leave behind, and how she wanted to leave it." I stared at the wax-sealed envelope, noting how different it was from the simple white envelope that had contained my name. This one was made of heavier paper, cream-colored with a slight texture that suggested it had been chosen carefully. The wax seal was deep red, almost burgundy, and the rose impression was detailed enough that I could make out individual petals. "She never mentioned anything about this to me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "About changing her will or setting up a safety deposit box. She always seemed so straightforward about money. She'd tell me to save my pennies, to not spend money on things I didn't need." Attorney Valdez smiled, and there was warmth in it that went beyond professional courtesy. "Rose was straightforward about money, but she was also much more complex than your family realized. She understood the difference between being frugal and being poor, between saving money and building wealth. She'd learned things during her years in America that she never felt the need to advertise." She gestured toward the wax-sealed envelope. "This contains a letter she wrote specifically for you, along with some documents she wanted you to have before we visit the safety deposit box. She spent months composing it, revising it, making sure every word was exactly what she wanted to say." My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the envelope. The wax was smooth under my fingertips, and I could feel the weight of papers inside, more than just a letter. The rose impression in the seal was so detailed I could almost smell the flowers Grandma Rose had grown in her backyard, the climbing roses that covered the back fence and bloomed in shades of pink and white every summer. "She made me promise to give this to you only after the family reading," Attorney Valdez continued. She said it was important that you hear their reactions first, that you understand how they saw the situation before you learned the complete truth. I looked up from the envelope, meeting her eyes. The complete truth about what? About who Rose Chen really was, she said gently, and about who she believed you could become. The words sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the conference room. There was something in Attorney Valdez's tone that suggested the safety deposit box contained more than old jewelry and family photographs, that the woman who'd raised 3 sons while working as a seamstress had been keeping secrets that would change everything I thought I knew about my family's history. Outside, the October afternoon was growing darker, the rain clouds settling over Portland like a gray blanket. The office building around us hummed with the quiet activity of people going about their daily business, unaware that 12 floors above them, a young art teacher was about to discover that her grandmother's life had been far more complicated and purposeful than anyone had imagined. I broke the wax seal carefully, trying not to damage the rose impression that Grandma Rose had chosen to mark this final communication between us. The wax gave way with a soft crack, and I unfolded the cream-colored paper to reveal her familiar handwriting, the careful formation of letters that came from someone who'd learned English as an adult and never stopped paying attention to the precision of each word. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, and already I could hear her voice in the formal phrasing, the way she'd always addressed me when she had something important to say. "If you are reading this, then I have gone to join your grandfather, and you have just sat through what I imagine was a very confusing will reading." I paused, looking up at Attorney Valdez, who was watching me with patient attention. "She knew it would confuse them," I said. "She planned for their reaction." "Rose was many things," Attorney Valdez replied, "but naive wasn't one of them. She understood exactly how your family would respond to the way she chose to structure her bequests. She wanted you to see that response before you understood why she'd made the choices she did." I returned to the letter, my grandmother's voice growing stronger in my mind with each carefully chosen word. "By now you have heard Michael receive the house, the car, and the checking account. You have watched your family's relief that the important things went to the person they believed deserved them. You have also seen their confusion about the safety deposit box, their assumption that whatever I left for you must be sentimental rather than substantial." The accuracy of her predictions was unsettling. She'd known exactly how Uncle Robert would focus on practical assets, how Aunt Linda would dismiss anything that didn't fit their understanding of value, how Michael would assume his inheritance represented the sum total of her worth. "What they do not know," the letter continued, "is that the checking account and the house represent only a small fraction of what I have accumulated over the past 40 years. What they do not understand is that I have been watching all of you very carefully, and I have made my decisions based not on who needs the most or who has accomplished the most in their eyes, but on who has the heart to use what I leave them in ways that honor the values I have tried to live by." My breath caught in my throat. The implication was staggering, suggesting that Grandma Rose had been operating on a level of financial complexity that none of us had suspected. The woman who'd mended clothes instead of buying new ones, who'd grown vegetables to save on grocery bills, who'd driven the same car for 2 decades, had somehow been accumulating wealth that she'd kept hidden from her own family. I came to America with nothing but my sewing machine and the belief that hard work and careful planning could build a better future. The letter went on. "For 40 years I have lived simply not because I had to, but because I chose to. Every dollar I did not spend on things I did not need. I invested in things that would grow. Every sacrifice I made was an investment in possibilities that my family could not yet imagine." I set the letter down for a moment, my hands shaking slightly as the full scope of what she was telling me began to sink in. Grandma Rose hadn't just been frugal, she'd been building something, creating a foundation that she'd kept hidden behind the facade of simple living and careful budgeting. Attorney Valdez leaned forward slightly. "This is difficult information to process," she said gently. "Would you like to take a break, or would you prefer to continue reading?" "I need to know," I said, picking up the letter again. I need to understand what she was doing, what she wants me to do. The next section of the letter was longer, written in the same careful script but with occasional words underlined for emphasis, as if Grandma Rose had wanted to make sure I understood the importance of what she was telling me. The safety deposit box contains documents that will give you access to investment accounts, property holdings and business partnerships that I have built over 4 decades of careful planning. The total value is approximately $2.3 million. All of it legally earned and properly documented for tax purposes. Attorney Valdez has been helping me manage these investments for the past 5 years, ensuring that everything would transfer to you smoothly when the time came. I stopped reading and stared at the number, certain I had misunderstood something. $2.3 million was an impossible amount, the kind of money that belonged to people like Michael's clients, not to elderly seamstresses who lived in modest houses and grew their own vegetables. "This is real?" I asked Attorney Valdez, holding up the letter. "She really accumulated this much money?" "Rose was an extraordinarily disciplined investor," she replied. "She started small, buying a duplex rental property in the 1980s when prices were low. She used the rental income to buy another property, then another. She invested in index funds before most people knew what they were. She bought stock in companies she understood, like the textile manufacturers she worked with, and held on to them for decades." She opened a folder on the table and showed me a sheet of papers covered with numbers, account balances, property addresses, investment portfolio summaries. The documents looked official and substantial, the kind of financial statements I associated with wealthy people, not with my grandmother who'd taught me to darn socks and make soup from vegetable scraps. "But why keep it secret?" I asked, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything I thought I knew about Grandma Rose. Why not tell the family? Why not use the money to make her life easier, or help Michael with his business, or help my dad with his mortgage? Attorney Valdez smiled, and there was something almost conspiratorial in her expression. "That's exactly the question Rose knew you would ask, and it's exactly why she chose to leave everything to you rather than to Michael or anyone else in the family." I returned to the letter, hungry now for the explanation that would make sense of this impossible revelation. "I kept my wealth private because I learned early in my life in America that money changes how people see you, how they treat you, how they understand your choices. If your family had known I was wealthy, they would have expected me to live like a wealthy person, to spend money on things that did not matter to me. They would have asked for loans, for investments, for help with expenses that they should learn to manage themselves." The wisdom in her words was striking, revealing a level of psychological insight that I'd never fully appreciated. She'd understood that revealing her wealth would have changed every relationship, every family interaction, every conversation about money and success and responsibility. More importantly, the letter continued, "I wanted to see who my family would become without the knowledge that there was a safety net waiting for them. I wanted to watch Michael build his business with his own efforts, to see whether he would develop wisdom along with wealth. I wanted to observe your father navigate his quiet, steady life, and find his own form of success, and I wanted to watch you, my dear Sarah, choose your path based on your own values rather than on the expectation of inheritance." I felt tears starting to form in my eyes as I began to understand the complexity of what she'd done. For decades she'd been conducting an elaborate test, watching her family's choices and character development while maintaining the perfect disguise of a simple, frugal woman living on a seamstress's pension. "What I discovered," the letter went on, "was that Michael, despite his business success, never learned to see beyond the obvious. He measured worth in terms of profit margins and property values. He was kind to me because he believed I was a poor old woman who needed his consideration, not because he valued me as a person with wisdom to offer." The accuracy of her assessment was painful but undeniable. Michael had always been courteous to Grandma Rose, but there had been a quality of condescension in his kindness, the way someone might be patient with a child who didn't understand how the adult world worked. "Your father,"
she continued, developed into exactly the man I hoped he would become: steady, honest, content with his own definition of success. He never asked me for money, never suggested I should change my lifestyle, never made me feel like my choices were inadequate. He understood that there are many ways to build a meaningful life. I thought about my father's quiet presence at family gatherings, his satisfaction with his accounting practice, and his small house and his garden that produced enough tomatoes to share with the neighbors. He'd never seemed jealous of Michael's more obvious success, never appeared to want anything beyond what he'd built for himself. But you, Sarah, the letter continued, and the handwriting seemed to grow more intense, more personal. You showed me something that neither of your cousins nor your uncles nor your father quite achieved. You showed me generosity without expectation of return. You showed me service without recognition. You showed me the ability to see value in things that others overlook. I had to pause again, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. The conference room had grown quiet around us, the rain softening to a gentle patter against the windows, the afternoon light fading into the early darkness of October in the Pacific Northwest. Every time you helped me with my garden, you did it because you enjoyed working with your hands in the soil, not because you expected anything in return. Every time you brought art supplies to show the children in the neighborhood, you did it because you believed creativity was important, not because anyone was watching or keeping score. Every time you visited me and listened to my stories about Taiwan, you did it because you valued the connection between generations, not because you thought it would benefit you someday. The specificity of her observations was overwhelming. She'd been paying attention not just to my actions but to my motivations, understanding the difference between behavior that comes from duty and behavior that comes from genuine care. I have spent 5 years working with Attorney Valdez to structure these assets in a way that will allow you to continue the work you are already doing, but on a scale that can create lasting change. The money is not meant to change who you are, Sarah. It is meant to amplify who you have already chosen to become. I looked up at Attorney Valdez, who had been sitting quietly while I read, respecting the private conversation between my grandmother and me. What does she mean about structuring the assets? What kind of work is she talking about? Rose established a foundation, she replied, opening another folder. The Sarah Chen Educational Arts Foundation. The $2.3 million is the founding endowment, but it's structured to grow over time through continued investment. The foundation's mission is to provide art education and supplies to underserved communities, exactly the kind of work you've been doing as a volunteer. The room seemed to tilt around me as the full scope of Grandma Rose's plan became clear. She hadn't just left me money, she'd created an entire framework for turning my small-scale volunteer work into a professional mission that could reach thousands of children instead of dozens. The beauty of the structure, Attorney Valdez continued, is that you'll draw a reasonable salary as the foundation's director, enough to live comfortably while doing work that matters to you. But the bulk of the money will continue working to serve others, growing the endowment and expanding the foundation's reach over time. I returned to the letter for the final section, where Grandma Rose's handwriting became slightly looser, more personal, as if she'd been writing with tears in her own eyes. My dearest granddaughter, I am giving you this responsibility not because you are perfect, but because you have shown me that you understand the difference between having money and being rich. Rich people accumulate wealth for themselves. People who understand money use it to create opportunities for others. I trust you to honor the values that brought me from Taiwan to America with nothing but hope and determination. I trust you to remember that the most important investments are not in stocks or real estate but in human potential and community connections. I trust you to use this gift in ways that will make our family name mean something beyond business success or social status. The letter concluded with a paragraph that I had to read 3 times before the words fully penetrated. Do not feel obligated to explain your inheritance to the family immediately. Take time to understand what you want to do with this opportunity. The foundation paperwork gives you complete control over how and when you reveal its existence. Michael received the house and car because he values tangible assets. You are receiving the foundation because you value intangible possibilities. Both gifts reflect what I believe each of you will use most wisely. Your loving grandmother, Rose Chen. P.S. The key to the safety deposit box will give you access to all the documents Attorney Valdez has mentioned, plus one additional item that I hope will remind you daily of the values that should guide your decisions. I folded the letter carefully, my hands still trembling slightly from the emotional weight of everything I just learned. The brass key felt different in my palm now, heavier with significance, warm with the promise of documents and resources that would change not just my life but potentially the lives of countless children who needed someone to believe in the importance of creativity and self-expression. Attorney Valdez was watching me with patient attention, clearly understanding that I needed time to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Outside, Portland's afternoon rush hour was beginning, the distant sound of traffic mixing with the ongoing patter of rain against the windows. "This is overwhelming," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm qualified to run a foundation, to manage this kind of money, to make decisions that will affect so many people." Rose spent a great deal of time thinking about exactly that concern, Attorney Valdez replied gently. "That's why she structured everything through a foundation with professional oversight, why she chose investment strategies that don't require daily management, why she included provisions for hiring additional staff as the foundation grows." She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more personal. "But more importantly, she chose you not because you have experience managing large sums of money, but because you have experience understanding what children need to thrive. The financial management can be learned or delegated, the mission, the heart of what the foundation will do, that requires someone who genuinely cares about the outcome rather than the recognition." I thought about my students at Roosevelt Elementary, their faces lighting up when they discovered they could create something beautiful with their own hands, their pride in displaying artwork that reflected their own unique way of seeing the world. I thought about the kids at the community center, some from families where art supplies were an unimaginable luxury, others from situations where school was their only safe space to explore creativity without judgment. The possibility of expanding that work, of reaching children in schools across the city, across the region, across the country, was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. It represented everything I'd ever dreamed of doing professionally, but on a scale that seemed almost impossibly ambitious for someone who'd spent her career teaching 25 kids at a time in a single classroom. "What happens next?" I asked. How do I begin to understand what this really means?" Attorney Valdez smiled, and there was something both professional and maternal in her expression. "Next, we schedule a time to visit the bank and open the safety deposit box. You'll see all the documents, review the investment portfolio, and begin to understand the scope of what Rose built over 4 decades. Then we start the process of transitioning the foundation from paperwork to active operation." She gathered the folders on the table, organizing them into a neat stack. "But before any of that, you should take some time to let this information settle. This is a life-changing revelation, and it's perfectly reasonable to feel overwhelmed by the possibilities and responsibilities it represents." I nodded, clutching the brass key and the folded letter, my mind racing with questions and implications I couldn't yet fully articulate. The conference room that had felt oppressive during the family reading now felt like a cocoon, a safe space where I could begin to imagine a future that was completely different from anything I'd ever considered possible. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, and somewhere in the distance the city of Portland went about its daily business, unaware that a young art teacher had just discovered that her grandmother's greatest work of art wasn't a quilt or a garden, but a carefully crafted plan to turn one person's lifetime of sacrifice into another person's opportunity to serve. Part 3. The Wells Fargo branch on Southwest 4th Avenue felt like a cathedral of marble and mahogany, all soaring ceilings and hushed reverence for the serious business of money. I stood in the lobby at 9:30 on a gray Thursday morning, clutching the brass key so tightly that its edges had left indentations in my palm. Attorney Valdez waited beside me, professional and composed in her charcoal wool coat, while I felt like an imposter in my best teaching outfit, a navy blazer that had seen me through job interviews and parent conferences. 3 days had passed since the reading, 3 days of restless nights and distracted teaching, 3 days of avoiding my family's increasingly frequent phone calls. Aunt Linda had left 4 voicemails, each one more pointed than the last, ostensibly checking on my emotional state but clearly fishing for information about what Grandma Rose had left me in that mysterious safety deposit box. Michael had stopped by Roosevelt Elementary yesterday afternoon, claiming he'd been in the neighborhood, though his gleaming Mercedes looked absurdly out of place in the school parking lot between the teachers' dented Hondas and rusty pickup trucks. He'd waited by my classroom door as I finished cleaning paintbrushes and organizing supplies for the next day, his presence filling the small space with expensive cologne and barely contained curiosity. "Hey," 'cause he'd said with that casual confidence that had always made me feel like I was somehow failing at being related to him. "Thought I'd see how you're holding up after all the family drama the other day." But his eyes had scanned my classroom with the calculating attention of someone appraising real estate, taking in the donated easels and mismatched chairs, the artwork covering every available wall surface, the coffee cans full of brushes that I'd bought with my own money because the school's art budget had been cut 3 years running. I could see him trying to reconcile this shabby, cheerful chaos with whatever he imagined might be waiting for me in Grandma Rose's safety deposit box. "I'm fine," I'd told him, continuing to wipe down tables painted with layers of tempera and watercolor accumulated over months of creative exploration. "Just processing everything, you know." Sure, he'd said, but his tone suggested he didn't know at all. "Listen, if there's anything in that safety deposit box that you need help understanding, financial stuff or legal documents or whatever, I want you to know I'm here for you." I mean, Grandma Rose was great, but she wasn't exactly sophisticated about complex financial instruments. The condescension in his voice had made my jaw clench, the assumption that our grandmother's financial arrangements would naturally be simple because she'd lived simply, that anything she'd accumulated would be modest and easily comprehensible to someone of his limited expectations. He'd had no idea that while he'd been building his reputation as a savvy young businessman, Grandma Rose had been quietly assembling a portfolio that would make his real estate ventures look like a child's lemonade stand. "I appreciate that," I'd said, not meeting his eyes as I continued my cleaning routine. "But I think I'll be okay figuring things out on my own." He'd lingered for a few more minutes, making conversation about my students and the school's programs, but his attention had kept drifting to the simple decorations in my classroom, the handmade bulletin boards and construction paper displays that spoke of someone who had to be creative with limited resources. I'd seen him calculating in his head, probably wondering what kind of treasures an elderly seamstress could possibly have left behind that would require a safety deposit box at a major bank. Now, standing in that bank lobby with Attorney Valdez, I felt the weight of those unspoken assumptions, the family's collective certainty that whatever Grandma Rose had hidden away would be touching but ultimately insignificant. They were expecting old jewelry, perhaps some savings bonds, maybe stock certificates for companies that no longer existed, the kind of financial relics that elderly people sometimes hoarded without understanding their current value. A bank employee approached us with the formal courtesy reserved for safety deposit box appointments, her smile professional and discreet. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of understated jewelry that suggested she dealt regularly with people who had significant assets to protect. Her name tag read Margaret Winters, Client Services, and she extended a manicured hand first to Attorney Valdez, then to me. "Miss Chen, I presume," she said, her voice carrying the warm professionalism that expensive banks cultivated for their more substantial clients. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Mrs. Rose Chen was one of our most valued customers for over 15 years. She spoke of you often during her visits." I felt a flush of surprise at her words. Grandma Rose had been a valued customer here, important enough that the staff remembered her personally, respected enough that they'd assigned a senior employee to handle her granddaughter's appointment. This wasn't the kind of treatment typically given to someone whose financial relationship with the bank consisted of a modest checking account and perhaps a small savings certificate. "She visited regularly?" I asked, trying to reconcile this information with my understanding of Grandma Rose's financial habits. In my mind, she'd been the kind of person who did her banking through ATMs and perhaps occasional visits to deposit Social Security checks. Margaret Winters smiled, and there was genuine warmth in her expression. Mrs. Chen came in quarterly to review her portfolio and make investment decisions. She was remarkably knowledgeable about market trends and had very specific ideas about asset allocation. She often mentioned that she was building something special for someone special, though she never revealed the details. Attorney Valdez and I exchanged glances, and I saw her nod slightly as if to confirm that we were about to discover exactly what Grandma Rose had been building during those quarterly visits. Margaret led us through a series of security doors, each requiring card access and personal identification, until we reached a vault area that felt more like a library than a basement storage facility. The walls were lined with safety deposit boxes in various sizes, each secured with dual locks that required both the bank's master key and the customer's individual key to open. Margaret consulted her records and led us to a box near the middle of the wall, larger than I'd expected, about the size of a small filing cabinet drawer. "Box 247, she announced, producing her own key and waiting for me to present the brass key that had been warming in my palm since we'd entered the building. Mrs. Chen upgraded to this larger size about 3 years ago. She said she needed more space for important documents. My hands shook slightly as I inserted my key into the lock, turning it in coordination with Margaret's key until we heard the soft click of the mechanism releasing. She slid the metal box from its slot in the wall and carried it to a private viewing room, setting it on a polished wooden table before discreetly withdrawing to give us privacy. The room was small and windowless, furnished with just the table, 2 chairs, and a small lamp that cast warm light over whatever secrets Grandma Rose had deemed important enough to store in this climate-controlled vault. Attorney Valdez sat beside me, her presence both professional and supportive, as I lifted the lid of the metal box and discovered that my understanding of my grandmother's life was about to change completely. The first thing I saw was a stack of documents bound with a red ribbon, the same deep burgundy color as the wax seal on the letter she'd left me. Beneath that were several smaller boxes, some leather, some metal, arranged with the careful precision that had characterized everything Grandma Rose had ever done. The entire contents of the safety
deposit box had been organized like a presentation, each item placed deliberately to tell a story that would unfold in a specific sequence. I untied the ribbon carefully, mindful that these might be the last physical objects my grandmother had touched, the final arrangements she'd made before trusting that her granddaughter would understand and honor her intentions. The documents were arranged in chronological order, each section marked with a small paper tab that had been labeled in her precise handwriting. The first section contained property deeds, not just for the modest house on 13th Avenue that Michael had inherited, but for 6 other properties scattered throughout Portland and the surrounding areas. There was the duplex in southeast Portland that Attorney Valdez had mentioned, purchased in 1987 for $38,000, and now worth nearly $400,000 according to the most recent appraisal. There was a small apartment building in the Alberta district, bought in 1992 when the neighborhood was still affordable, now sitting in one of the city's most desirable areas. Each property deed was accompanied by rental records, maintenance logs, and financial summaries that demonstrated decades of careful management and reinvestment. Grandma Rose hadn't just been a property owner, she'd been a shrewd real estate investor who'd recognized Portland's growth potential long before the city became a destination for young professionals and tech companies. She managed all of this herself. I asked Attorney Valdez, spreading the property documents across the table. The scope of the portfolio was staggering, representing millions of dollars in real estate assets that she'd accumulated through careful timing and reinvestment of profits. For the first 20 years, yes, Attorney Valdez replied. She handled tenant relations, maintenance coordination, financial tracking, everything. It was only in the last decade that she hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations. Even then, she reviewed every major decision personally. The next section of documents contained investment account statements from 3 different brokerage firms, each showing portfolios that had grown steadily over decades of consistent contributions and compound interest. The investment strategy was conservative but sophisticated, heavy on index funds and dividend-paying stocks, with smaller positions in individual companies that she'd researched and believed in for the long term. I recognized some of the company names from her stories about the textile industry, manufacturers and suppliers she'd worked with during her seamstress years. She'd parlayed her insider knowledge of which companies were well managed and financially stable into stock purchases that had grown exponentially over the intervening decades. A $1,000 investment in a fabric supplier's stock in 1985 was now worth nearly $50,000. But it was the third section of documents that truly revealed the scope of her financial sophistication. These were partnership agreements and business contracts for investments I'd never imagined she would understand, let alone participate in. She'd been a silent partner in a successful restaurant group, investing in their expansion when they were still a single neighborhood establishment. She'd provided seed funding for a small manufacturing company that produced eco-friendly textiles, parlaying her industry knowledge into ownership stakes that had generated steady income for over a decade. How did she learn to do all this? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the evidence of financial acumen that seemed completely at odds with the grandmother who'd taught me to darn socks and make soup from leftovers. Where did she get the knowledge to make these kinds of investment decisions? Attorney Valdez smiled, and there was pride in her expression as she answered. Rose was one of the most disciplined students I've ever met. When she decided to become serious about investing, she spent 2 years reading every book she could find about real estate, stock markets, and business finance. She attended free seminars at the library, joined investment clubs, subscribed to financial magazines. She approached learning about money the same way she'd approached learning English when she first came to America, with total dedication and systematic effort. The mental image of Grandma Rose sitting in library seminars about portfolio diversification, taking careful notes in her precise handwriting, asking thoughtful questions about market trends and risk management, was both inspiring and humbling. While her family had assumed she was living a simple retirement focused on gardening and television, she'd been quietly educating herself about complex financial instruments and building wealth with the same meticulous attention she'd once applied to tailoring perfect seams. The fourth section contained documents related to the Sarah Chen Educational Arts Foundation, and seeing my name on legal paperwork that represented such significant resources made the reality of my new responsibilities feel suddenly concrete. The foundation had been established 3 years ago, with Grandma Rose as the founding donor and Attorney Valdez serving as the legal representative until such time as I was ready to take over active management. The initial endowment was exactly what the letter had promised, $3 million, carefully invested in a balanced portfolio designed to generate steady income while preserving the principal for long-term growth. But what struck me most forcefully were the detailed program outlines Grandma Rose had developed, describing specific ways the foundation could support art education in underserved communities. She'd researched successful models from other cities, identified gaps in current programming, and developed implementation strategies that reflected both financial prudence and genuine understanding of how children learn and grow through creative expression. The documents revealed that she'd spent months visiting schools, talking to teachers and administrators, observing art classes, and understanding firsthand the challenges that limited resources created for educators trying to provide comprehensive creative programming. There were budget projections for mobile art studios that could visit schools without dedicated art rooms, supply grants for teachers who spent their own money on materials, scholarship programs for students who showed artistic talent but lacked resources for advanced training. Each program had been researched thoroughly, with pilot project proposals and measurable outcome goals that demonstrated she'd approached foundation planning with the same systematic thinking she'd applied to her investment strategy. She spent 2 years developing these programs, Attorney Valdez explained as I read through page after page of thoughtful planning. She volunteered at several schools, not identifying herself as someone with resources to help, just as a grandmother who wanted to support children's education. She wanted to understand the real needs from the ground level before committing foundation resources to addressing them.
I thought about the times Grandma Rose had asked detailed questions about my teaching, about the challenges I faced in providing art supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them, about the creative projects that worked best with limited budgets and classroom space. I'd assumed she was just being a supportive grandmother, interested in my professional life, but not necessarily understanding the complexities involved in education funding and resource allocation. Now I realized she'd been conducting research, gathering information that would inform foundation programs designed to address exactly the problems I'd described to her. Every conversation about my students' needs, every story about successful projects or frustrating limitations had been contributing to a comprehensive understanding of how the foundation could make the most effective difference. The final section of documents was smaller but somehow more personal than the financial and legal paperwork that preceded it. These were letters, dozens of them, written in various hands and addressed to Mrs. Rose Chen or the anonymous donor. They were thank you notes from families, teachers and community organizations that had apparently been receiving quiet support from Grandma Rose for years. Dear Mrs. Chen, one letter began, we wanted to thank you again for the art supplies you donated to Lincoln Elementary's after-school program. The children have been so excited to work with real watercolor paints and quality paper. Attached are some photos of their finished projects, which they wanted to share with the kind lady who made their artwork possible. Another letter, this one typed on official school letterhead, expressed gratitude for funding that had allowed a middle school to hire a part-time art teacher when budget cuts threatened to eliminate the position entirely. Your generosity has directly impacted 312 students this year, the principal had written. Many of them discovered talents and interests they never knew they had, and several are now considering art-related careers for their futures. Letter after letter revealed a pattern of strategic giving that had been flying completely under the family radar for years. Grandma Rose hadn't just been accumulating wealth, she'd been actively using portions of it to support exactly the kind of work that I'd been trying to do as a volunteer. She'd been funding art programs, providing supplies, supporting teachers, and creating opportunities for children to explore creativity, all while maintaining perfect anonymity and never discussing her charitable activities with anyone in the family. How many programs was she supporting? I asked, overwhelmed by the evidence of systematic generosity that must have required significant financial resources and careful organizational effort. 12 ongoing commitments, Attorney Valdez replied, consulting a separate list, plus emergency response funding for schools that faced unexpected budget cuts or program cancellations. She allocated approximately $60,000 annually to direct educational support, separate from the foundation endowment. The scope of her giving was staggering, representing more money than I earned in a year being quietly distributed to support programs that aligned perfectly with the foundation's mission. She'd been operating as a one-person charitable organization for years, developing relationships with schools and teachers, evaluating program effectiveness, and providing ongoing support that had made real differences in children's educational experiences. At the bottom of the safety deposit box, beneath all the documents and letters, was a small leather jewelry box that looked familiar. It was similar to the one she'd left me in her official will, but older and more worn, with a brass clasp that had been polished smooth by decades of handling. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. The locket was warm in my hands, heavier than its small size suggested, and when I pressed the tiny spring mechanism, it opened to reveal two photographs. On the left was a picture I'd never seen before, Grandma Rose as a young woman, perhaps 25, standing in front of what looked like a sewing factory with a group of other women. She was smiling, but her eyes held a determination that spoke of someone who understood exactly how hard she would have to work to build the life she wanted. The photograph on the right showed a more recent scene that I recognized immediately. It was from my college graduation, taken on the steps of Portland State University with the city skyline in the background. But it wasn't an official graduation photo, it was candid, caught at a moment when I wasn't posing for the camera. I was laughing at something someone had said, my cap slightly askew, my expression full of joy and possibility. What struck me most about the juxtaposition was how similar our expressions were across the decades that separated the two photographs. The same determined optimism, the same belief that hard work and careful planning could create opportunities that didn't yet exist. Grandma Rose had captured something in that graduation photo that I'd never noticed about myself, a quality that connected us across the years, and justified her faith in my ability to carry forward the work she'd begun. Tucked behind the photographs was a small piece of paper with a message written in her familiar handwriting. The first picture shows where I started. The second picture shows where you begin. The work continues, but now it's yours to guide. I closed the locket carefully and fastened the chain around my neck, feeling the gentle weight settle against my chest like a talisman. The metal was still warm from my hands, and I could imagine Grandma Rose wearing it during all those quarterly visits to the bank, all those anonymous donations to schools, all those careful investment decisions that were building toward this moment when her granddaughter would discover that love could be expressed through financial planning as clearly as through any other language. Attorney Valdez had been watching me silently as I explored the contents of the safety deposit box, allowing me the time and space to process each revelation at my own pace. Now she leaned forward slightly, her expression both professional and deeply personal. "There's one more thing," she said gently, reaching into her briefcase and producing a final envelope, this one sealed with simple tape rather than wax. "Rose asked me to give this to you after you'd seen everything else, after you understood the full scope of what she built, and what she's entrusting to you." The envelope was lighter than the others, containing just a single sheet of paper with a brief message that somehow carried more emotional weight than all the financial documents combined. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then you now understand that your grandmother was not the simple woman your family believed her to be. You understand that I spent 40 years building something that would outlast my own life, something that would continue creating opportunities for children long after my garden has grown wild, and my sewing machine has fallen silent. But I want you to know that the money, the foundation, the investments and properties and careful planning, none of that is really what I'm leaving you. What I'm leaving you is the knowledge that one person, working quietly and consistently over many years, can create changes that touch hundreds or thousands of other lives. The foundation will give you resources and opportunities that I could never have imagined when I arrived in America with my sewing machine and my determination to build something better. But the real inheritance I'm giving you is not financial. It's the understanding that the most important work is often the work that no one sees, no one applauds, no one recognizes until years later when the results speak for themselves. Use this gift wisely, not because I'm watching, but because the children who will benefit from your choices deserve someone who understands that true wealth is measured not in what you accumulate, but in what you create for others." The letter was signed simply, Grandmother Rose, but below her signature was a postscript that made me smile through the tears I'd been trying to control. "P.S. Your cousin Michael is a good man, but he measures success in terms of personal achievement. Your father is also a good man, but he measures success in terms of personal contentment. You are the only one in our family who measures success in terms of service to others. That is why you are ready for this responsibility, and that is why I trust you to honor not just the letter of my intentions, but the spirit of them as well." I folded the final letter carefully, adding it to the growing collection of documents that represented not just financial assets, but a comprehensive philosophy of how money could be transformed into opportunity, how individual sacrifice could become community benefit, how one person's lifetime of careful choices could create resources for countless others. The safety deposit box was empty now, all its secrets revealed, all its careful planning exposed to daylight and decision-making. I sat in that small windowless room, surrounded by the evidence of my grandmother's extraordinary hidden life, trying to absorb the reality that I was now responsible for continuing work that she'd begun decades before I was born. Attorney Valdez began gathering the documents, organizing them into folders that would make the transition to active foundation management more systematic. "This is a lot to process," she said kindly. "Take whatever time you need to think through what you want to do next. The foundation can continue operating in its current form while you decide how you want to shape its future direction." But even as she spoke, I could feel something shifting inside me, a sense of purpose that was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. The work Grandma Rose had been doing in secret, the programs she'd been funding anonymously, the children whose lives had been enriched by her quiet generosity, all of that could now be expanded and formalized and sustained beyond anything one person could accomplish alone. I thought about my students at Roosevelt Elementary, their faces lighting up when they discovered they could create something beautiful, their pride in artwork that reflected their own unique ways of seeing the world. I thought about the kids at the community center, the ones whose families couldn't afford art supplies, the ones for whom creative expression was a luxury that existed only when someone else provided the materials and opportunity. Now I could provide that opportunity not just for 25 students at a time, not just for the kids who happen to live in my neighborhood, but potentially for thousands of children across the city, across the region, across the country. The scope of possibility was overwhelming, but it was also energizing in a way that made me understand why Grandma Rose had spent years preparing for this transition. As we packed the final documents and prepared to leave the safety deposit box viewing room, I realized that the brass key I'd been clutching for days had unlocked much more than a metal container full of papers. It had opened a door to understanding who I could become if I had the courage to accept the responsibility that came with resources, the opportunity to transform individual compassion into institutional change. The locket around my neck felt warm against my skin, a reminder that this inheritance wasn't just about money, or even about the foundation's mission. It was about the continuation of values that had sustained an immigrant woman through decades of sacrifice, values that had guided her investment decisions and her charitable giving, values that would now shape my own choices about how to use wealth in service of others. Outside the bank, Portland's October morning was crisp and bright, the earlier rain having given way to the kind of clear autumn day that made the city look like a postcard. I stood on the sidewalk with Attorney Valdez, surrounded by the normal bustle of downtown business, while inside my head everything had changed. I was still Sarah Chen, elementary school art teacher, but I was also now Sarah Chen, foundation director, inheritor of resources that could reshape how I thought about my own potential impact on the world. The weight of responsibility was significant, but it felt like the good kind of weight, the kind that comes from knowing you have the tools to make a real difference, and the obligation to use them wisely. Grandma Rose had spent 40 years building this opportunity, and now it was my turn to honor her vision while making it my own. Part 4. Final 6 months later, I stood in the main gallery of the Portland Community Arts Center, watching 12-year-old Maria Gonzalez explain her multimedia sculpture to a small crowd of donors and community leaders. Her piece, constructed from recycled materials and painted with vibrant acrylics, told the story of her family's journey from Honduras to Oregon through abstract shapes that somehow captured both the difficulty of displacement and the hope of new beginnings. "I used broken glass for the dangerous parts," she explained with the serious confidence of someone who'd discovered she had important things to say through art, "but I painted it with gold paint so it looks beautiful instead of scary. My mom says that's what happened to our family too, that the hard parts became beautiful when we got here and found people who helped us." The adults listening nodded appreciatively, but I could see they were genuinely moved rather than just politely attentive. Maria's work had that quality that transcended technique and age, speaking directly to something universal about resilience and transformation. She was one of 47 students participating in the Sarah Chen Educational Arts Foundation's first major exhibition, and her sculpture was drawing more attention than pieces created by artists 3 times her age. The gallery was full tonight, not with the usual crowd of arts patrons who attended these events out of social obligation, but with families from the communities we served, teachers who'd watched their students flourish with access to quality materials and instruction, and local leaders who were beginning to understand that art education was about much more than teaching children to draw and paint. The foundation's programs had been operating for 4 months now, and the results were already exceeding every projection Grandma Rose had included in her careful planning documents. We'd started small, just as she'd outlined in her program proposals. The mobile art studio, a converted van equipped with supplies and portable easels, visited schools that had lost their art programs to budget cuts. The supply grant program provided materials to teachers who'd been spending their own money to give students creative opportunities. The scholarship fund supported children who showed artistic talent but lacked resources for advanced training. But what surprised me most was how quickly the programs had grown beyond even Grandma Rose's ambitious projections. Word spread through the community in ways that formal marketing could never achieve, carried by children who came home excited about art projects, by teachers who finally had resources to implement lessons they'd only dreamed about, by families who saw their kids discovering talents and interests they'd never had the opportunity to explore. The Foundation's board, carefully selected with Attorney Valdecia's guidance, included educators, community leaders, and financial advisors who brought expertise I was still developing, but they'd made it clear from the beginning that program decisions would be mine to make, that Grandma Rose had chosen me not just to manage resources but to shape the Foundation's direction based on my understanding of what children needed to thrive creatively. That understanding had deepened considerably over the past months. I'd visited dozens of schools, observed hundreds of art classes, talked with teachers and administrators and parents about the role creativity played in children's overall development. What I'd discovered was that art education wasn't just about producing future artists, it was about teaching problem-solving skills, building confidence, encouraging self-expression, and creating opportunities for success for students who might struggle in more traditional academic subjects. Maria finished describing her sculpture and moved on to answer questions from other visitors, but I remained nearby, watching her interact with adults who were clearly impressed by her thoughtfulness and creativity. 6 months ago, she'd been a quiet kid in an overcrowded middle school classroom, someone whose artistic interests were considered irrelevant by an education system focused on standardized test scores and college preparation. Now she was articulating complex ideas about art and identity to community leaders who were beginning to rethink their assumptions about which subjects deserved funding priority. "Sarah," a familiar voice said behind me, and I turned to see Attorney Valdecia's approaching with a small group that included the mayor's education advisor and the superintendent of a neighboring school district. "I was just telling Dr. Morrison about our expansion plans for next year. He's very interested in bringing the mobile studio program to his district." Over the months, Attorney Valdecia's had transitioned from legal representative to trusted advisor, helping me navigate the complexities of foundation management while encouraging me to trust my instincts about program development. She'd also become something of a friend, someone who understood the weight of responsibility that came with managing resources that could genuinely change lives. Dr. Morrison was a tall, soft-spoken man in his 50s, who'd built his reputation on innovative approaches to education funding. "Miss Chen," he said, extending his hand with the kind of genuine warmth that suggested he was more interested in outcomes than recognition, "your mobile art program is exactly what our smaller schools need. We have 6 elementary schools that lost their art teachers to budget cuts, but we've been struggling to find cost-effective ways to restore programming." These conversations had become routine over the past months, as word about the Foundation's work spread through education circles and community organizations. School districts were approaching us about partnerships, other foundations were asking about collaboration opportunities, and individual donors were offering to support specific programs. The foundation that Grandma Rose had established to serve Portland was drawing interest from communities across the Pacific Northwest. "We're definitely interested in expanding," I replied, though part of me still felt surprised to hear myself speaking with such confidence about budget allocations and program scaling. "Our board is reviewing proposals for next fiscal year, and we're particularly focused on reaching rural schools that have been completely cut off from arts programming." The conversation continued for several minutes, covering details about implementation timelines and resource requirements, but I found myself distracted by the larger scene around us. The gallery was full of life in a way that felt both celebratory and purposeful, with children and teenagers explaining their artwork to adults who were clearly seeing these young people in a new light. This was what Grandma Rose had envisioned when she'd spent years researching and planning and investing. Not just an art exhibition, but a community gathering that demonstrated the connection between creative education and broader social development. The foundation wasn't just providing art supplies, it was creating opportunities for children to be seen as thoughtful, capable individuals with valuable perspectives to share. Morrison finished outlining his district's needs and moved on to speak with other board members, but Attorney Valdez lingered beside me, her expression thoughtful as she watched the crowd moving through the gallery. "Rose would be proud," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching careful planning come to fruition. This is exactly what she hoped would happen, but I think even she would be surprised by how quickly the programs have grown. I nodded, fingering the locket around my neck that had become a daily reminder of the values guiding my decisions. The foundation's rapid growth was gratifying, but it was also slightly overwhelming, requiring me to make choices about resource allocation and program priorities that affected hundreds of children and dozens of schools. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm moving too fast," I admitted, watching a group of high school students demonstrate printmaking techniques to younger children. Grandma Rose spent decades building the resources for this foundation, and I'm expanding programs every few months. What if I'm being irresponsible with what she worked so hard to create? Attorney Valdez smiled, and there was understanding in her expression. "Rose spent years watching you make decisions about how to use limited resources in your classroom and your volunteer work. She saw how you prioritize student needs over personal comfort, how you found creative
solutions when funding wasn't available, how you never let bureaucracy prevent you from helping children who needed support." She gestured toward the gallery full of student artwork and engaged families. "This isn't irresponsible expansion. This is what happens when someone who understands the real needs finally has adequate resources to address them systematically." Her words were reassuring, but they also reminded me of how dramatically my life had changed since that rainy afternoon in the Morrison Building conference room. 6 months ago, I'd been a single elementary school teacher, living paycheck to paycheck, someone whose impact was measured in individual students rather than institutional change. Now I was managing a foundation with a multi-million-dollar endowment, making decisions that affected educational programming across multiple school districts. The transition hadn't always been smooth. There had been steep learning curves about nonprofit administration, board governance, and strategic planning. There had been moments of doubt when the responsibility felt too large, too important to trust to someone with my limited experience in organizational management. But there had also been moments of profound satisfaction when a program worked exactly as intended, when children's lives were genuinely improved by having access to resources and opportunities that hadn't existed before the foundation's intervention. "Sarah," the voice belonged to Marcus Washington, one of my former students who was now in 8th grade and participating in our advanced scholarship program. He approached with the easy confidence of a teenager who discovered his artistic talents and was eager to share his latest project. "Miss Chen, you have to see what I made in the printmaking workshop," he said, using my formal name with the kind of respect that suggested he understood I was still his teacher, even though our relationship had evolved beyond the traditional classroom dynamic. Marcus had been one of my students 3 years ago, a quiet kid who'd struggled with reading but had shown remarkable talent for visual composition. His family couldn't afford art supplies or lessons, and his middle school had eliminated its art program the year after he'd left elementary school. When the Foundation's scholarship program launched, he'd been one of our first recipients, and his development over the past months had been remarkable. He led me to a display area where several students were demonstrating different printmaking techniques, and I could see immediately that his work had reached a new level of sophistication. His prints combined realistic imagery with abstract elements in ways that created emotional depth and visual interest that would have been impressive from someone twice his age. "This is extraordinary, Marcus," I said, genuinely amazed by the complexity of his artistic thinking. "How did you develop this technique of layering different images?" "Miss Rodriguez taught us about registration and multiple colors," he replied, referring to the professional artist we'd hired to teach advanced workshops. "But I wanted to try mixing photography with drawing, so I experimented with different ways to combine them." What struck me most about Marcus's explanation was his comfort with technical terminology and his confidence in describing his creative process. This was a kid who'd been struggling academically when I'd known him in elementary school, someone whose talents had been invisible in traditional classroom settings. Now he was articulating sophisticated ideas about artistic technique and demonstrating problem-solving skills that transferred far beyond art making. "Are you thinking about art as a career?" I asked, curious about how the scholarship program was affecting his long-term goals and self-perception. "Maybe," he said thoughtfully. "But I also like the idea of teaching art to other kids, maybe starting programs in schools that don't have them." Miss Rodriguez says there are colleges that train people to be community art educators. His answer was so perfectly aligned with the Foundation's mission that I felt a moment of profound gratitude for Grandma Rose's vision. She'd understood that the goal wasn't just to support individual artistic development, but to create a generation of young people who would carry forward the values of creative education and community service. Marcus returned to his demonstration, and I continued moving through the gallery, stopping to admire work created by students from across the Foundation's various programs. Each piece told a story not just about individual creativity, but about what became possible when children had access to quality materials, skilled instruction, and encouragement to explore their ideas through art. Near the back of the gallery, I noticed a familiar figure standing alone in front of a large collaborative mural created by students from 3 different schools. Michael was wearing his usual expensive suit, but his expression was different from the confident calculation I'd grown accustomed to seeing at family gatherings. He looked genuinely absorbed by the artwork, studying the details with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. I approached him slowly, uncertain about his presence, but curious about his reaction to the exhibition. We hadn't spoken much since the Foundation's public launch 3 months earlier, though I knew through family conversations that he was aware of my new role and the scope of the programs we were implementing. "Michael," I said quietly, not wanting to startle him out of his contemplation of the mural, "I didn't know you were planning to attend tonight." He turned toward me, and I was surprised to see something that looked like pride in his expression, mixed with what might have been a touch of bewilderment. "Hey Sarah," he said, his usual confident tone replaced by something more thoughtful. "I heard about the exhibition through the Chamber of Commerce newsletter. They featured the Foundation as one of this year's most impactful new nonprofits." The Chamber of Commerce recognition had been unexpected but gratifying, representing acknowledgement from the business community that our work was contributing to broader economic development through education improvement. Several local companies had reached out about partnership opportunities, and we'd received inquiries from foundations in other cities interested in replicating our programs. "What do you think?" I asked, gesturing toward the mural that had captured his attention. It depicted scenes from Portland neighborhoods, created by students from different communities working together to represent the diversity of the city they shared. "It's remarkable," he said, and there was genuine amazement in his voice. "I mean, I knew you were doing something important with the Foundation, but seeing all of this..." He paused, seeming to search for words that could adequately express his reaction. "These kids created this, with programs that didn't exist 6 months ago." I nodded, feeling the same sense of wonder that had characterized so much of my experience over the past months. The collaborative projects have been some of our most successful initiatives. Students from different schools work together on pieces that reflect their shared community, and they learn as much from each other as they do from the professional artists we bring in to guide the process. Michael continued studying the mural, his businessman's eye clearly trying to calculate the organizational complexity required to coordinate such an ambitious project involving multiple schools and dozens of students. "How do you manage all of this?" he asked finally. "The logistics alone must be incredibly complicated." "It is complicated," I admitted, "but we have an amazing staff now, and our board brings expertise in areas where I'm still learning. The key is staying focused on the mission, rather than getting overwhelmed by the administrative details." "The mission," he repeated thoughtfully, and I could see him processing concepts that were probably foreign to his experience in real estate development. "Which is what exactly?" "I mean beyond just providing art classes." The question gave me an opportunity to articulate something I'd been thinking about frequently as the Foundation's work had expanded and deepened. The mission is creating opportunities for children to discover their own capabilities and express their own ideas through creative work. But it's also about building communities that value creativity and understand that artistic education contributes to broader social development. I gestured around the gallery, where families from different neighborhoods were mingling, and children were proudly explaining their artwork to adults who were clearly seeing these young people in new ways. Tonight isn't just an art exhibition, it's a demonstration of what becomes possible when we invest in human potential, rather than just test scores and college preparation. Michael nodded slowly, and I could see him trying to reconcile this explanation with his understanding of how institutional change happened and resources were allocated. His world was one of measurable returns on investment, quarterly profit reports, and tangible assets that could be evaluated according to established market criteria. "Grandma Rose really saw all of this potential in you," he said after a moment, his tone carrying a combination of respect and residual confusion. "I have to admit, at the will reading, I thought the safety deposit box would contain some old jewelry, or maybe a small savings account she'd forgotten to mention. I never imagined," he trailed off, but his meaning was clear. None of our family had imagined that Grandma Rose possessed the financial sophistication to accumulate significant wealth, or that she'd been conducting a decades-long evaluation of her grandchildren's character and capabilities. They certainly hadn't imagined that the quiet art teacher would emerge as the inheritor of resources that could create institutional change on a regional scale. "She was watching all of us more carefully than we realized," I said gently, not wanting to make him feel diminished by Grandma Rose's choice, but also not wanting to minimize the intentionality behind her decision. "She saw different strengths in different people, and she structured her bequests accordingly. I got the house and the car because I value tangible assets," he said, demonstrating that he'd been thinking seriously about the implications of how Grandma Rose had divided her estate. "You got the foundation because you value intangible possibilities." His insight was remarkably accurate, reflecting a level of self-awareness that I hadn't expected from someone whose professional success had always seemed so straightforward and unexamined. Maybe seeing the scope of what the Foundation had accomplished in just a few months was forcing him to reconsider his assumptions about what constituted meaningful achievement. "Both kinds of value are important," I replied, wanting to acknowledge his contributions without diminishing the significance of the choice Grandma Rose had made. "Your business creates jobs and housing and economic development. The Foundation creates opportunities for individual growth and community building. They're different approaches to making positive change. But your approach affects more people," he said thoughtfully, watching a group of elementary students demonstrate clay working techniques to fascinated adults. "And it affects them in ways that last beyond any individual transaction or business deal." The observation was both generous and perceptive, suggesting that Michael was beginning to understand why Grandma Rose had seen foundation management as requiring different skills and motivations than business development. Success in his field was measured in profits and property values. Success in mine was measured in human development and community transformation, outcomes that were harder to quantify, but potentially more significant in terms of long-term social impact. Michael, Sarah, Aunt Linda's voice carried across the gallery with the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested she was still uncertain about how to navigate the changed family dynamics that had resulted from my inheritance. She approached us, wearing an elegant cocktail dress, and the slightly bewildered expression of someone attending an event she didn't quite understand. "This is all so impressive, dear," she said, air-kissing my cheek with the careful precision of someone who'd been practicing social graces for decades. "I had no idea there were so many children in the city interested in art, and the families all seem so engaged." Her tone carried the faint surprise of someone discovering that people from communities different from her own were capable of sophisticated cultural appreciation. She'd spent most of her adult life in social circles where charity events were attended primarily by donors rather than beneficiaries, where the people being helped remained abstract rather than present and articulate. "The families have been incredible," I replied, choosing to interpret her comment generously rather than responding to the subtle condescension embedded in her surprise. "They understand better than anyone else how important these programs are for their children's development." Aunt Linda nodded politely and began asking questions about the foundation's operations, but I could see her struggling to reconcile the scale of what she was witnessing with her assumptions about what her niece was capable of managing. In her worldview, significant organizational leadership required credentials and connections that she didn't associate with someone who'd spent years teaching elementary school and living in a studio apartment. Uncle Robert joined our conversation after a few minutes, having finished examining the financial information we'd provided about the foundation's budget and program costs. His questions were more direct than his wife's, reflecting his business background and genuine curiosity about how nonprofit management compared to for-profit operations. "Your overhead costs are impressively low," he said, consulting a program brochure that contained detailed financial transparency information. "Most nonprofits spend 30 to 40% of their budget on administration, but you're operating at less than 15%. How do you manage that level of efficiency?" "We have the advantage of starting with adequate funding," I replied, grateful for Attorney Valdez's insistence that the foundation maintain complete financial transparency with both donors and the community. "When you don't have to spend time and resources constantly fundraising for basic operations, you can focus your energy on program delivery. And you're already planning expansion into other regions," he continued, clearly having done his homework about the foundation's strategic planning. "That's ambitious for such a new organization." "The demand is there," I explained, thinking about the dozens of inquiries we'd received from school districts and community organizations across the Pacific Northwest. Art programs have been cut from education budgets everywhere, not just in Portland. "We have the expertise and resources to help communities restore creative programming, and the model we've developed is replicable in different settings." Uncle Robert nodded approvingly, and I could see him mentally comparing the foundation's growth trajectory to business expansion patterns he understood from his own professional experience. Unlike Aunt Linda, he seemed genuinely impressed, rather than confused by what we'd accomplished, perhaps because organizational scaling was something he could evaluate according to familiar criteria. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said finally, and there was sincerity in his voice that went beyond polite family support. "She always said you had good judgment about people and priorities." I don't think any of us realized she was talking about organizational leadership potential. The comment reminded me of how much our family's understanding of each other had shifted over the past months. I was no longer just the impractical art teacher who needed financial advice from more successful relatives. I was someone managing resources and making decisions that affected hundreds of families, someone whose work was drawing recognition from community leaders and education professionals.
But the most significant change wasn't in how my family saw me, it was in how I saw myself, in my growing confidence that Grandma Rose had been right to trust me with resources that could create lasting institutional change. The work was challenging, and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that classroom teaching, despite its rewards, had never been. My father appeared at my elbow just as Uncle Robert was finishing his questions about the Foundation's strategic planning. He'd been moving quietly through the gallery for the past hour, stopping to admire student artwork and engage in conversations with families about their children's experiences in our programs. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice carrying the kind of pride that had characterized our relationship since childhood, but was now mixed with something that looked like awe. "This is extraordinary. I keep thinking about Mom, about how she would have loved seeing all of these families celebrating their children's creativity." His words brought tears to my eyes, partly because of their emotional accuracy, but also because they reminded me that Grandma Rose's influence extended far beyond the financial resources she'd accumulated. Her values, her belief in quiet service and community investment, were evident in every aspect of what the Foundation was accomplishing. "She planned all of this," I said, gesturing around the gallery full of student artwork and engaged families. "Not the specific details, but the vision of what could happen when children have access to quality creative education. She spent years researching and thinking and building the resources that made tonight possible." My father nodded, his expression thoughtful as he processed the full scope of what his mother had accomplished during the years when the family had assumed she was living a simple retirement, focused on gardening and television. She was always watching and planning more carefully than the rest of us realized. I should have known she had something bigger in mind. The gallery was beginning to empty as the evening wound down, families gathering their children and making plans for future visits to the Arts Center. Students were carefully packing their artwork, proud of the recognition they'd received and excited about continuing their creative development through the Foundation's ongoing programs. I found myself standing near the collaborative mural that had captured Michael's attention earlier, studying the details of the work that students from different communities had created together. The project represented everything the Foundation was trying to accomplish, bringing together young people from diverse backgrounds, providing them with quality materials and instruction, and creating opportunities for them to express their own ideas while contributing to something larger than individual achievement. Attorney Valdez approached as I was preparing to leave, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd watched careful planning come to successful fruition. "Rose would have loved tonight," she said quietly, echoing my father's earlier comment, but adding her own perspective as someone who'd worked directly with Grandma Rose to develop the Foundation's structure. "I keep thinking about her quarterly visits to the bank," I replied, remembering the evidence of decades of systematic investment and planning that had made tonight's exhibition possible. All those years when she was making decisions about asset allocation and program development, building something that would outlast her own life. "She understood something that most people never learn," Attorney Valdez said thoughtfully. "That individual impact is limited by individual resources and lifespan, but institutional impact can continue growing long after the person who created it is gone." Her words reminded me of the responsibility I'd inherited along with the financial resources, the obligation to ensure that the Foundation continued operating according to Grandma Rose's values, while adapting to changing community needs and educational challenges. It was a responsibility that felt both daunting and energizing, requiring me to think beyond immediate program outcomes toward long-term sustainability and growth. "What's next?" she asked as we prepared to leave the gallery and return to the practical work of Foundation management and program development. "We've got 3 new school districts requesting mobile studio partnerships," I replied, thinking about the expansion plans that were both exciting and slightly overwhelming. "And there's a group of retired teachers interested in developing art therapy programs for children who've experienced trauma." Ambitious as always, she said with a smile that suggested she was pleased, rather than concerned by the scope of our ongoing plans. Rose trained you well for this kind of systematic expansion. As we walked out of the Arts Center into the cool October evening, I realized that 6 months had passed almost exactly since that afternoon in the Morrison Building when I'd first learned about the safety deposit box and begun to discover the true scope of my grandmother's hidden life. The Portland skyline looked the same as it had that day, the Willamette River still flowing steadily toward the Columbia, the city continuing its steady growth and change. But everything else had transformed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during that confused and overwhelming will reading. I was no longer the overlooked family member sitting at the far end of the conference table, uncertain about my place in the family hierarchy, and resigned to being dismissed as impractical and unambitious. I was someone managing resources that could create lasting change, someone whose decisions affected educational opportunities for hundreds of children, someone whose work was drawing recognition from community leaders who understood that creative education contributed to broader social development. The foundation that Grandma Rose had established was already exceeding her most optimistic projections, and we were just getting started. The locket around my neck felt warm against my skin as I walked to my car, a daily reminder of the values that guided my decision-making and the connection between past sacrifice and future possibility. Tomorrow I would return to the practical work of foundation management, reviewing grant applications and visiting schools, and making decisions about resource allocation that would determine which programs received funding and which communities gained access to creative educational opportunities. But tonight I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that Grandma Rose's faith in my capabilities had been justified, that her decades of careful planning and systematic investment were creating exactly the kind of lasting institutional change she'd envisioned. The work would continue, growing and adapting and reaching new communities, but the foundation she'd built would ensure that her values of quiet service and community investment would influence educational opportunities for generations of children she would never meet, but whose lives would be enriched by her foresight and generosity. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where the Foundation's mobile studio had visited schools, where children who'd never had access to quality art supplies were now creating work that reflected their own unique perspectives and capabilities. Some of those students would discover artistic talents that would shape their career choices. Others would develop problem-solving skills and creative confidence that would serve them in whatever fields they eventually chose to pursue. All of them would carry forward an understanding that creativity was valuable, that their own ideas mattered, that communities became stronger when they invested in human potential rather than just measurable outcomes. That understanding, multiplied across hundreds of students and dozens of schools, would create changes that extended far beyond individual artistic development toward broader cultural transformation. As I pulled into my driveway, I thought about calling my father to thank him for attending the exhibition, but then decided that conversation could wait until tomorrow. Tonight I wanted to sit quietly with the knowledge that 6 months of intensive work had culminated in an evening that demonstrated the power of systematic investment in human potential. Grandma Rose had spent 40 years building the resources that made tonight possible, planning and saving and researching, until she could create opportunities that would outlast her own lifetime. Now it was my responsibility to honor her vision while adapting it to changing needs and expanding possibilities. The work was challenging, sometimes overwhelming, frequently more complex than anything I'd encountered during my years as a classroom teacher, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that connected directly to the values Grandma Rose had tried to instill in our family: the importance of quiet service, the power of systematic effort, and the understanding that true wealth was measured not in personal accumulation, but in community contribution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new decisions about how to use resources in ways that created lasting positive change. but tonight I fell asleep, knowing that the woman who'd measured success in terms of service to others had chosen wisely when she'd entrusted me with the tools to continue her work on a scale she could have barely imagined when she'd first arrived in America, with nothing but a sewing machine and the determination to build something better. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.